No worries there. Our scripture today is Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for their sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. But because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins as well as for those of the people. But one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also, Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." I practiced that one too. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. No, I didn't do that one right either.
Melchizedek. It's a tough one.
I know, I practiced it all morning too.
All right. So we are on the home stretch here in our journey through the Bible. We've been through the entire Old Testament and most of the New Testament now. We've done the Gospels and Acts and some of Paul's letters. And so today we turn to the book of Hebrews. And so one question for us to consider is whether Hebrews is actually a letter or not. It's grouped together with the other letters in the New Testament, but it doesn't really read like them. So, we have a certain format that letters take today where you start off, dear so-and-so, and then, at the end you have a sincerely or all the best or whatever, and you sign your name. In the ancient days, letters had a different format, but they followed kind of a prescription as our letters do today. But Hebrews doesn't really do that. It doesn't start off with a salutation. It doesn't have those kinds of things. And so perhaps it's not actually a letter, but more of a sermon or a treatise on some theology. So last week when we talked about letters, we said that they have a mix of theology and practice, but Hebrews is very heavy on the theology part of that. There's not as much practical application. It really is much more focused on the theology. So when I think of it, I don't really think of it as a letter like the other books, but as something kind of unique. And so that's one of the reasons why we're looking at it distinctively than the other letters. So we don't know who wrote Hebrews. Most books in the New Testament, especially the letters, at least claim an author, but Hebrews doesn't. It never says, who wrote it. Paul has traditionally been considered the author of it back in ancient times, but no scholars today really think that Paul wrote it. Origen, who was a pastor and theologian in the 3rd century, suggested that maybe Clement of Rome wrote it, or even Luke, the author of the Gospel and Acts, wrote it. But again, we don't really know. One of the interesting proposals or suggestions is that a woman named Priscilla, who's named in the book of Acts, might have been the author. If so, then Hebrews is likely the only book in the Bible written by a woman. So I think that's fun to consider and to think about. Other suggestions have been Barnabas or Apollos, but again, we don't know who wrote the book. We do know, however, that there is heavy use of Old Testament language and imagery and concepts. And so whoever wrote it probably was a Jew and was written to a Jewish Christian audience, perhaps to those who were being persecuted and thinking of converting back to Judaism from Christianity. In some ways, the letter reads as a defense of the Christian faith in contrast to the Jewish faith, and why people should continue to put their faith and trust in Jesus as opposed to simply the Jewish faith on its own. And so the main theme related to that is Christology, which is how we understand the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And the letter itself compares Jesus to lots of other people, to prophets, to angels, to Moses, to this strange guy named Melchizedek, and to others. And it identifies Jesus as God's son and as a high priest and mediator. And so in the end, the conclusion that is reached in the book of Hebrews is that everyone else falls short of what God is trying to accomplish in the world, but that Jesus doesn't. That the prophets fall short, even angels fall short, Moses fell short, Melchizedek, all these other people, but Jesus doesn't. Jesus is sufficient and is enough for us. It's not the law or the prophets or another priest who can save us. It's only Jesus. And so therefore, we need to place our faith and our trust in Jesus Christ. And so again, Jesus is portrayed as a great high priest in our passage. That's the image that's used for him and throughout the book of Hebrews. And so we're left wondering, what is a high priest, or what was a high priest? Why is this image important? It's obviously not something that we have today, and so it might feel a little distant and removed from us. And so I think a little background information might be helpful. So the high priest was part of Jewish custom and law. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was the first high priest. And so this office was passed down within his family. That throughout history, it kind of transferred to a few other people and stuff. But the idea was that it would be passed down from within a family. And in Jesus's day, the high priest was a man named Caiaphas. You might remember that name from the stories around Jesus's death. He is one of the people involved in that and involved in kind of the conspiracy to have Jesus crucified. And one of the main important duties of the high priest was on the Day of Atonement. On that day, once a year, it was a day in which the entire people of God would confess their sins and seek forgiveness from God. And the physical act of that is that the high priest would make a sacrifice, and then only once per year, would go into what was known as the Holy of Holies within the temple, kind of the very inner sanctum of the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept and some other things, and where it was thought that God's presence actually dwelt in that place. And so it was a holy and a sacred place, and so it was only to be approached once a year to seek forgiveness on behalf of the entire Jewish people for their sins for the previous year. The high priest did some other things, but that's kind of the thing that is most noteworthy. By the time of Jesus's day, the high priest also became kind of a political figure. So Caiaphas was actually appointed by Roman officials to serve in that capacity. And so there's this mix of religion and politics involved in Jesus's day around all that. And so what about priests in general, not just the high priest? In chapter 5, verse 1, it says that every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. In other words, it's the priest's job to serve as a go-between between God and humanity, to connect the human and the divine, to bridge the gap that exists between us. And so Jesus, who we believe was both fully human and fully divine, was in a unique position to be able to do this once and for all. priests and other high priests and were able to do it on a temporary kind of short-term basis. But Jesus is able to bridge this gap once and for all people and for all time. And so just as that veil was torn in the temple at Jesus' death, that veil that separated God from humanity, through Jesus Christ, we now have direct access to God. There's no longer that separation. And so related to this great high priest, the name Melchizedek comes up in our passage and in a few other places in the book of Hebrews. He's mentioned twice in our passage, and he is from the book of Genesis in the 14th chapter. I think when we were originally going through the Bible, I mentioned him, and this is one of the reasons why, because there's a connection here in the New Testament. But Melchizedek is a priest king who blesses Abram before he's even Abraham. He comes from, I think it's the city of Salem, and there's this battle that Abraham goes through and is victorious, and then this king and priest Melchizedek comes out and blesses Abram, and Abram offers an offering to him, to God. And so there is this guy Melchizedek who lies outside of the priestly line of Aaron, who's not a high priest in that sense, but is a high priest in another sense. And so one of the problems of using priestly imagery for Jesus, especially from a Jewish perspective, is that Jesus is not from Aaron's line or from the tribe of Levi. He's from David's line. And so it makes sense to use kingly imagery for Jesus because David was the great king. And so Jesus can follow in his footsteps because he's in the lineage of David. But it's more problematic to use priestly imagery for Jesus because he's not of the Levitical tribe or from the line of Aaron. And so Melchizedek kind of solves that problem from a theological perspective. He is an example of someone who is a high priest and is named as one in the Old Testament, but who does not come from Aaron's line. And so since someone else can fit those shoes, Jesus can as well. Since there's this precedent of Melchizedek for priests coming outside of Aaron's line, Jesus can do that as well. And so Jesus is named a priest in the order of Melchizedek, or in the same way that Melchizedek was. And so we think about Jesus as priest, and so there's that theological aspect of it, how we make sense of it as a go-between, as someone who is worthy, who is willing to sacrifice himself. But there's also this practical aspect of what did it actually look like for Jesus to serve in a priestly capacity. So if we skip to the next page, there is a passage from Hebrews, and I'll read it for us again. And as I do, I invite you to listen specifically for some things that Jesus did that we might follow. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. If we look at the next slide, I think there are three specific things that Jesus did in this passage that we can emulate, that we can try to follow. And so the first of those is time in prayer. It says that Jesus offered up prayers and supplication. That meant that Jesus spent time in prayer, and we see that, many examples of that, right? He teaches the disciples to pray, as we'll pray later in the service. And there are many times where he goes away off by himself to spend time alone and in prayer. And so prayer is kind of the foundation for the work and ministry that Jesus does. And it should be for us as well, especially during this time where we are stuck at home much more than normal. Perhaps it might open up opportunities for us to spend more time in prayer since we're not so busy doing other things out in the world. All right, so then the next one is obedience. It talks about Jesus submitting to God and being obedient. And we can do that as well. We can submit to God and to obey God's commandments and God's desires. Both, I think, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. To follow those things that are written down in Scripture, the commandments to love one another, to the 10 commandments that we spent time on, and all those different things. But then also simply to allow God's love to reign in our heart and to follow wherever that leads us. And then lastly, it says that Jesus is made perfect, which is oftentimes problematic language for people. But for us as United Methodists, we have a particular understanding of what perfection means. For us, and following in the footsteps of John Wesley, perfection simply means to love fully, to allow God's love to be shed abroad in our hearts and to have that love outpour from us into the world. That is what true perfection looks like. And so I think that's exactly what Jesus did. You see in every interaction that he has, it's motivated by love. And so that is the hope and the goal for us as followers of Jesus Christ, to allow that love to live inside of us and to pour out from us as we interact with others and as we go about everything that we do. So these three things are simple, they're short, but they're difficult to do. Setting aside time to pray, following God's commandments, even loving fully are hard to do. But I do think that it's what we're called to do as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus. One of the other things that this passage says, if we want to skip to the next slide, is that being a priest is a privilege. The news that we've shared today is bittersweet for me. I have absolutely loved being your pastor, and I'm very sad to be leaving Blakemore. At the same time, I also feel that it's time for this chapter to close, and I'm excited for the next challenge that lies ahead, both for me and for you as a church. But this passage has really had me reflecting this week on what it means to be a pastor or a priest. And so this verse 4 says, "One does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God." I have very much felt God's calling and hand at work as I have served as your pastor. I feel like I was the right person at the right time for Blakemore. I think it's been a great fit, and as I reflect back on the last 5 years, it has been a joy to be with you. I've been through a lot personally, the church has been through a lot, and I think we have come out stronger on the other side. As I reflect on where the church was when I arrived and where we are today, I think we are in a stronger and healthier and a place of more vital ministry. And so I give thanks for that, and will always remember Blakemore fondly. And so today, I simply want to express my gratitude for the humbling opportunity you have allowed me to be your pastor. So I'm grateful for that. So in conclusion, yep, go ahead and skip to that next one. There we go. We're going to break out in small groups as we have been doing, and there are a few questions for us to consider. So in the end, Hebrews encourages us to put our faith in Jesus Christ as our great high priest. And during this pandemic, during the upcoming transition as well, and always, we are called to do that. Because Jesus is worthy and he alone is able to save us. And so especially as we enter into a time of transition as a church and as me moving and stuff, we're called to trust in Jesus and to follow his lead. And so I want us to ponder that this morning as we break into the groups. So these are the questions to answer and think about. How will you commit to trusting Jesus during this time? And will you spend time in prayer, obedience, and seeking perfection in love? All right, so I'm going to break us into our small groups and give us 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together. So you should receive an invitation to go into your groups now.